In the summer of 2010, the peaceful coastal town of Porto Ercole, Italy, became the scene of a momentous discovery. It was the end of a long trail, the final chapter in a mystery that had gripped the art world for 400 years. Beneath the floor of a burial crypt lay a mass of human bones. There was good reason to believe that among them were the remains of one of the greatest artists of all time, one who had turned the art of painting on its head, and then disappeared without trace.
Caravaggio invented a completely new kind of naturalistic and realistic painting. And I think his main contribution to the art world is to create overwhelmingly illusionistic paintings with extraordinary psychological complexity and with theatrical and wonderful uses of light and shade.
I actually think that Caravaggio was the first great director in the world of art.
What makes Caravaggio such a special artist for me is that he changed perception of the surrounding world. He essentially saw things in a new way.
Caravaggio certainly caused a stir in the Rome of the late 1500s. His work was so different that the effect on his contemporaries was almost shocking, and he did nothing to try to soften the impact. On the contrary, he courted controversy by portraying religious scenes in contemporary settings and using models of dubious reputation. Endlessly energetic, Caravaggio pursued his vision of vivid realism through a detailed exploration of perspective and light, jealously guarding his techniques while forging a new and unique approach. His character, like his art, was confrontational and uncompromising. Bold, driven, ingenious. He was both loved and hated, but never ignored. Caravaggio's real name was Michelangelo Merisi. He was born near Milan in the town of Caravaggio, Lombardy, from which he took the name by which he became known.
He definitely had an apprenticeship in Milan with Simone Peterzano, which probably lasted 4 years. At least that is what the records seem to show. But we have to remember that not all painters who went for such apprenticeships went into the rather lofty area of painting figure paintings. There were many more artists who had to do decorations, arabesques, grotesque decorations for houses, for studioli and all that. And only a very few actually went to the top of their profession to paint history paintings.
In his 20s, Caravaggio moved south to Rome.
One of the really astonishing things about Caravaggio is that he makes a very slow start as a painter. We know nothing that he did. He arrives in Rome when he's 21, which is actually quite old. Artists were apprenticed at 13, 14. We can't be entirely certain where Caravaggio went, but he seems to have hawked his talents around various Roman studios. First of all, the studio of Lorenzo Siciliano, a very little-known Sicilian painter. Then the studio of Antiveduto Grammatica, who was also a comparatively minor painter. And he finishes up in the studio of the Cavaliere d'Arpino, who is the most famous painter in Rome. So at this point, his career begins to take off. Right from the very start, he decides to be provocative and to thrust his naturalism into the face of Roman connoisseurs.
Caravaggio knew how he wanted his paintings to look, but achieving it was no simple matter. For him, light was the key to everything. It was what gave real life its intensity, its dynamism. And this, more than anything, is what he wanted for his paintings. His resources were limited, but he experimented endlessly, adjusting light and shadow in the search for his goal, the portrayal of absolute reality. Caravaggio left no record of his methods, but we do have an inventory of his studio's contents, drawn up in 1605. Among the objects were a large mirror and a mirror shield.
By copying, by imitating what he actually sees in the real image, he is able to capture. This is quite the reverse of what other painters did.
16th century artists in general designed paintings according to what they and their patrons expected to see. But Caravaggio was different.
Caravaggio doesn't paint things that he can't see, and he doesn't have any structure underneath. No drawing is really there. The outlines are not the basis of his design.
In his biography of Caravaggio, Giovanni Baioni tells how an early self-portrait was achieved using a mirror. The first attempt was somewhat flat, not, according to Baioni, a great success. The mirror concentrates the image, compressing perspective, a technique pioneered by Leonardo da Vinci. It has the additional advantage of keeping track of the subject's position between sittings. It also, of course, reverses the image, making this particular Bacchus left-handed. As Caravaggio matured, his use of mirrors continued as his skill and confidence grew. His paintings are meticulously precise in their details, but the technique can have drawbacks.
These lenses and mirrors had great limitations. It's not like a camera lens by any means. And when he was copying very closely, he certainly wanted to get things extremely accurate. And so there are distortions because of these shifts of position, the pose, and there are certainly shifts when it comes to single objects.
Caravaggio was supremely successful with small groups, but with larger scale works, he seemed less confident in his composition. X-rays of the multi-figure Martyr of St. Matthew reveal that the original version had classical architecture in the background. Going deeper, we can see that 3 earlier figures were later removed. And within the finished picture, there are some strange anomalies, apparent errors of perspective.
It's embarrassing in its disproportion. Arms, legs, nothing is in balance. Why was such an extraordinary gifted painter, so good at working with people and so attentive into details, put such an absolutely disproportionate figure in the center of the most important painting he had made up until then?
Caravaggio guides our vision in a dynamic sense inside the crowded composition and makes us focus on each individual detail. We don't think that the feet of St. Matthew, who fell during the Mass in which he was martyred, should be that big. They are actually out of proportion compared to his head. We don't notice it because they are far apart. This is an example of the psychology of perception.
Once you get to understand a Caravaggio picture, you can see that there are multiple viewpoints.
At first glance, the supper at Emmaus, for example, does not appear obviously strange. But look at the prophet to the right. The hand farthest from us is larger than the hand reaching forward. And compare it to the basket of fruit and the hand of Christ. Yet this was a painter obsessed with realism and perspective, well schooled by the masters of the Renaissance. So how do what appear to be errors fit into Caravaggio's revolutionary vision?
These result sometimes in some distortions. They are the result of his working method rather than a deliberate ploy to be different.
Caravaggio is very ambitious. You know, that he comes on the Roman scene and starts painting in a very provocative way and is trying to attract attention to himself.
I think that he was an opportunist who found a wonderful trick, and to a certain extent everybody did say, yes, this is much more realistic than anything that we've seen before.
He split the Roman art world into two completely opposing camps in a way which I think had not really happened before. So you get the naturalistic artists all ganging up together and saying that art has been freed by Caravaggio and that the purpose of art is to paint well and to paint the natural world well. Then you get the older artists who believe that he's a threat to education, to everything that an idealizing Italian tradition had stood for.
In 2001, British artist David Hockney put forward the idea that Caravaggio may have been using a camera obscura.
David Hockney is really the first to have raised this seriously. He is a practical painter and can see the way that a painting is made. I think that he also feels sometimes that some of these critics think that Caravaggio was so clever he didn't need to use any techniques. He could do it off the top of his head.
In the mid-1500s, the ideas of Daniel Barbaro had caused quite a stir among Italian artists. He described a technique for producing images using the principle of a camera obscura, a box with a pinhole which allows a limited amount of light to enter. The light rays, constricted by the size of the aperture, then create a photographic image.
This was an extraordinary achievement which we belittle if we think that it is simple to do because it is of optical origin.
According to some scholars, Caravaggio could well have turned his workshop into a large-scale camera obscura. Certainly Giulio Mancini, a friend of the painter, describes his study as a space with darkened walls. The first requirement would have been a brightly sunlit outdoor space available for setting up the objects to be painted. Then a lens was needed to replace the pinhole. Inside, the studio had to be in total darkness. Then the canvas could be moved to find the exact position where the light passing through the lens would recreate the upside-down image of the basket. Not all of the image could be in focus at once, but by moving the canvas, different details could be highlighted as required.
The painter would have focused continuously on one or another detail, and by changing the focus, he also changes the dimension of the object being projected. He therefore would have to continuously change the perspective.
The camera obscura gives you a fixed image upside down of your subject. When you see it in the clarity of full Technicolor, it is amazing.
The camera obscura did indeed come into its own during the following century, especially among Venetian artists such as Canaletto. For by then, the glassmakers of Venice had improved the quality of the lenses, making the images sharper and more usable. These new devices were perfect for allowing the famous scenes of Venice to be accurately fixed into a preliminary sketch. But in Caravaggio's time, lenses were not so reliable. His contemporary Galileo had to resort to grinding his own before he could produce his game-changing telescope. If Caravaggio had been using a camera obscura, he would have been struggling against uneven odds.
Caravaggio is an artist who presents detail, makes selective choices and juxtaposes them, or at times superimposes them one after another.
He is a theatre director. He chooses his actors well, and then he places them in the right positions. And something like the card shops, you've got the same model sitting on the other side of the table. It's really quite amusing.
Caravaggio's painting tells the story of two criminals in the act of swindling their hapless victim. But a closer look reveals that there is indeed a suspicious likeness between two of the card players. It lends credence to the theory that Caravaggio composited his work, painting each character in turn, even using the same model, differently dressed. Given the poor quality lenses available to Caravaggio, some art historians believe that instead of a camera obscura, it's likely that he made more use of a concave mirror to focus the image on the canvas. But again, the focus is only partial and must be constantly adjusted. It means that the artist must compromise a large painting by compositing, creating details in isolation. But perhaps the answer is simpler, and his technique was, after all, more straightforward.
A characteristic always visible in Caravaggio's paintings is that the size of the figures are always on a one-to-one scale. They correspond exactly to the size of the models. This characteristic could indicate that he actually projected the shadows of his models onto the canvas using sunlight.
The drawback to this theory is that the sun, coming through a skylight, would only have lit the subject directly for about 10 minutes a day, even without passing clouds. But allowing for that, the idea would have worked.
In his works, we have often found traces of shadows that were actually shadows projected from frontal light that allowed him to actually design an outline.
Another theory is that Caravaggio used a viewfinder and a sheet of glass as a drawing device.
It's a very old instrument. One of the first perspective instruments used in workshops was glass. It was used by Leonardo, illustrated by Albrecht Dürer in his famous essay that was well known in the workshops of the painters. Glass basically allows a painter to trace the outline of an object or figure directly onto the sheet of glass.
The viewfinder works by establishing a unique point of view that fixes the chosen perspective vanishing point. With his eye fixed, the painter begins tracing the outlines of the compositions on the glass. This way, the three-dimensional depth of the subjects is reduced to a two-dimensional plane, with perspective in place. The result? A huge saving in the artist's time. Once the outline is completed, the glass plate can be backlit with a lantern, projecting the sketch onto a canvas. Modifying the distance between the glass and the canvas changes the size of the image, much like a photographic enlarger. The enigma of Caravaggio's two Medusas, identical in every way except in size, is seen by some to support the assumption that Caravaggio did make use of this technique.
Here we are faced with two paintings, both on spherical surfaces. Because these shields are both convex and spherical, if taken to the same scale and superimposed, they would be perfectly identical as if they were photocopies. But actually, one of them is larger than the other. So how did Caravaggio transfer the drawing into the larger one with such precision? The assumption I made is exactly that of using drawing on glass and projecting the drawing. Having removed the shield from behind the glass and placing a second white shield, he could have projected this drawing onto the second shield with a lantern. By moving the lantern or the shield or the glass, he could have obtained the image enlarged to the size he needed. Therefore, the enlargement of approximately 10 centimeters between one shield and the other could well be explained this way.
If we go in search of the material traces that Caravaggio left in his works, we realize that the underlying drawing is there. Infrared now lets us see it.
Examination of the deep layers of the crowning with thorns reveals the precise marking out of the shadows. Particularly evident are those surrounding the soldier's hat. It could be confirmation that Caravaggio began by projecting the shadows onto canvas to fix their positions. These indentations, traced with an awl, appear to define the borders between light and shade that create the powerful impression of this scene.
The strong shadows he projected are extremely well constructed, but they are not as real as they appear to be. None of the shadows in his paintings correspond to the shadows formed by natural rays of light.
Caravaggio's light is just an illusion, but a splendid illusion.
I think there were many artists in the early 17th century for whom Caravaggio was central in all sorts of different ways. I don't think that many of them sort of knew the technique and adopted how he approached things. He stayed in his cellar, he didn't want to come out and show how he did things, and a lot of people would have given their eye teeth to find out exactly what he was up to. They saw the results, they were amazed.
Caravaggio's real secret lay in his creation of dramatic presence. And whatever the aids he used, the key to that lay in the use of light and shadow.
the light is something which comes from a single source. And this is a key to understanding his command of perspective, because he realized that if you observe the angles of shadow and light consistently throughout a picture, then you have a realistic interpretation.
But how did he manage to project such sharp shafts of light on his subjects? The most likely solution is that he used a mirror to reflect natural sunlight, using the mirror's concave surface to focus the light powerfully wherever he wished it to fall. It would give him the freedom to control his subject's lighting, much in the style of a modern-day cinematographer, creating those all-important contrasts and shadows. And if the mirror was adjustable, the sun's rays could be tracked and used throughout the day. Many of Caravaggio's canvases carry incised marks, made most probably with a brush handle. Researchers believe that these recorded the border lines between light and shadow for later stages of painting. As studies continued, researchers realized that Caravaggio didn't use just one single source of light, as he seemed to want people to believe. He probably lit selected details with carefully placed additional mirrors. When the stage was set, the final touch would be a flat mirror, reflecting the scene exactly as he wanted it to appear. This would have been the image Caravaggio finally painted. The light may be natural, but it's artificially manipulated to produce a very specific, contrived image. In pursuit of his goal, Caravaggio did not hesitate to cross natural borders and even sacrifice perspective. Caravaggio achieved his effects by beaming light into darkness, but his own life had a darker side of its own.
Caravaggio was throughout his life known as very quick-tempered, given to outrageous acts, instinctively violent. All the way through his career in Rome is involved in street fighting. 1598 he gets picked up in the Piazza Navona for carrying a sword and compasses. Then in 1604 he shamefully attacks a young painter from behind. In 1605, Caravaggio gets involved in attacking the house of two women. And in the same year, he gets involved in stabbing in the back a notary. There are also sort of minor events, like he gets thrown into prison for swearing, he gets thrown into prison for throwing stones. He does also seem to have had a taste for attacking people from behind, which is quite shameful, really.
But Caravaggio's dubious temperament doesn't seem to have put people off his work. Quite the reverse.
Caravaggio becomes extremely successful and celebrated, and he has some trouble coping with his success and goes around Rome showing off the entire time how famous and celebrated he now is. So he's not entirely good at handling success. But he does get a series of other commissions, like the paintings for Santa Maria del Popolo, the contract for the Death of the Virgin in Santa Maria della Scala, and commissions pour in
His paintings were already gracing the walls of Rome's society elite. But the major commissions were a chance to really make his mark. In the church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome, he certainly had a challenge. He was commissioned to paint canvases for the Chirazi chapel, but they were to go on the side walls, flanking a huge central altarpiece by Annibale Carracci. To steal the scene from the great Carracci, Caravaggio needed to devise something really dramatic. He decided to design his painting of the Crucifixion of St. Peter using a novel perspective that took account of the viewpoint from which it would be seen. When he saw his second canvas, the conversion of St. Paul, in place, Caravaggio realized that it didn't work as well. It was too busy for the confined space, and the detail was lost. He didn't hesitate. He replaced the painting with a new one, simpler and more dramatic, and making even more effective use of his groundbreaking perspective illusion.
No Roman artist before Caravaggio had ever painted religious scenes in oil on canvas in a chapel as completely illusionistic. You know, when you go in, these figures seem to be really there, and these activities in which they're engaged, the stories which he's telling, seem to be unfolding before our very eyes. And I think the naturalism and the illusionism of these paintings still knocks you out.
Immediately, the horse is the first thing you see, enormous, dominating the center of the scene. And it's only later the viewer notices the beautiful figure of St. Paul on the ground. He too has his arms spread like Annibale Carracci's Assumption. When the viewer enters the chapel, he is taken by those two paintings, as if they were a theatrical scene, constricted in a small space in which the two paintings speak to one another.
People were very taken with the idea of showing religious moments of the Christian story as they had actually happened. And when you come to think of it, these people obviously had their hair standing on the back of their necks when they saw these things and saw that this was really how it might have happened. They could almost be there in a way that none of the history paintings that preceded Caravaggio could ever convey.
After the success of his work in Rome, Caravaggio was commissioned to work in Naples.
Caravaggio was already known in Naples. They'd heard of him, and some Neapolitan artists had already come to Rome, studied the works in San Luigi dei Francesi, quoted his works in their own works in Naples. So he doesn't come as an unknown artist. He's already celebrated, he's already well known. But Naples is completely different from Rome, and there isn't really the sense of connoisseurs and collectors discussing art in complicated ways and having very high theoretical understanding of what modern painting should be, but they did know they wanted the latest celebrity, the latest novelty, and Caravaggio immediately gets a string of quite important commissions.
One commission in particular attracted the attention of well-to-do Neapolitan society. The Seven Acts of Mercy is regarded as the definitive painting of the Caravaggio revolution, influencing generations of 17th century Neapolitan painters. It also attracted the admiration of the Viceroy of Naples, the most powerful man in Italy after the Pope. The Naples commissions had been well timed. Caravaggio's talent for painting was equalled only by his propensity for self-destruction. Latterly in Rome, his disregard for the law and willful determination to shock had made him some powerful enemies. He had reached into the lowest strata of society, not just for his own diversion, but to choose models for his paintings. When he depicted known prostitutes as saints, the church authorities were scandalized. He had gone too far. One of his most famous paintings, The Death of the Virgin, caused an uproar.
These are real people for the first time, and that was incredibly emotional for people to see. And he excelled in this task of showing individuals as they really were. Whether it pleased his patrons or whether he displeased them because he set the Madonna in the image of a courtesan, this is two sides of the same coin.
He seems to have used as a model a prostitute whom he knew well. High churchmen do make a point of saying no painter is to use a prostitute as a model. And I think they didn't like this. You know, they go into the church and recognize this well-known courtesan representing the Virgin Mary. So this didn't go down at all well. But I think above all, the painting was just so novel. And when you see it now, it still knocks you out.
Another controversial painting, his Madonna and Child with St. Anne, brought into Caravaggio's life a man who one day would hold over him the power of life or death. The papal Secretary of State, Scipione Borghese, was captivated by Caravaggio's work, and he had the means to satisfy his appetite. His generous church stipend allowed him to fill his entire palace in Rome with art.
He wanted these things because they were extraordinary, and he had to have the most extraordinary works of art that there were available. He took it upon himself to fill his house and to redecorate his palaces in the most lavish way possible, and he didn't brook any opposition. He marched into people's studios when they'd been painting something for somebody else, and he grabbed it for himself.
He was an inspired collector. He was rapacious. He's also completely ruthless and uses dreadful methods for building up his collection.
Scipione Borghese's greed for Caravaggio's work turned out to be insatiable, as the painter was to discover to his cost. Around this time, Caravaggio's behavior was becoming more and more erratic and increasingly violent.
Rome itself is very, very violent, and young men wandering around the streets, draw their swords as easily as a cat arches its back. There's also the code of honor, and this again is very important to Caravaggio.
On Sunday the 28th of May 1606, blood replaced paint on Caravaggio's hands. He had killed a man in a senseless brawl. The papal authorities lost patience with the troublesome painter and imposed on him the heaviest sentence in their power. Caravaggio was given a banda capitale, in effect a death sentence, by Pope Paul V.
Scipione Borghese then offered to arrange Caravaggio's pardon in exchange for all of his paintings. He already had 100 of them, so he was a scoundrel.
A banda capitale is a condemnation to death, but it means that whoever meets you or runs into you or is in a position to take you prisoner can put you to death and send your head to Rome.
So Caravaggio's departure to Naples was more than convenient. It enabled him to escape from Rome and the long arm of papal justice. It was the start of a 4-year exile that would end only with his death.
And for the rest of his life, Caravaggio, to some extent, lives in fear.
Fortunately for him, his talent enabled him to leave behind one life and pick up the threads miles away. But his life could never be entirely the same. In some ways, his problems were only beginning. Whilst in exile, Caravaggio seemed haunted by the thought of losing his head. Over a 4-year period, he painted 5 explicit beheadings.
These are, in fact, illustrations of the foreboding, of the fear of death that haunted Caravaggio.
You feel that he knew that he was about to die, and that some of these very late paintings seem kind of anticipations of death.
More than fame and fortune, Caravaggio wanted to be pardoned. He sought it by joining the Knights of Malta.
Most 17th century painters wanted to be knights, but I think also there's a kind of web of connections of patrons, collectors who had strong links with the Knights of Malta. And I think it's highly likely they encouraged Caravaggio to go to Malta as the first step on the path back to Rome. If he could get himself accepted in Malta, continue to make his name known, this might be a step back on the road to being again rehabilitated in papal Rome.
But it didn't work. Caravaggio got himself into a fight and had to escape to Sicily. He was now pursued by even more people.
Fear hunted him from place to place. But it's only to some extent, because a lot of the time he's wandering around totally celebrated in Naples and Malta, painting, sought after.
For despite all this, Caravaggio was again overwhelmed with commissions.
So he has this very curious double status for the rest of his life, as celebrity and as bandit at the same time.
In the course of 9 months, he painted no less than 4 large altarpieces, and his workload increased when he resumed his petition for a pardon. His most passionate collector, Scipione Borghese, was more powerful than ever.
If you wanted a pardon, Borghese is the person to whom you would go. So I think it's almost certain that he was trying to tempt the cardinal with paintings into giving him a pardon to welcome him back to Rome.
But while Caravaggio was trying to paint his way to freedom, he might also have been painting his way into an early grave. Contemporary records show that he was becoming quite unstable, which could indicate that the heavy metals in his paint were affecting his mind.
Sources of the time say that he seemed unbalanced. This tells us that he was deeply stressed and more engulfed by thoughts of impending death.
Lured by the prospect of a pardon, Caravaggio headed back to Naples in October 1609. But trouble went with him. Shortly after he arrived, he was ambushed as he left a tavern. No one knows for sure who attacked him. It could have been the Knights of Malta seeking revenge, or a botched attempt at executing his death sentence for the reward, or even a random attack. But it is clear that it left him seriously wounded.
There were no disinfectants. There were no antibiotics. And this wound would have had serious repercussions. Here we have an attack on the central nervous system, compounded by a weakened immune system. In short, he was defenseless against the most banal diseases.
Caravaggio's convalescence seems to have been slow. Normally prolific, he produced only 2 paintings in the 8 months following the attack. He seemed to have reached the end of the road. His only hope now was the elusive pardon and a return to a calmer life in Rome. Then, in the summer of 1610, came the long-awaited news. His patron, Scipione Borghese, had finally made good his promise of a pardon. Though still recovering from his attack, Caravaggio wasted no time in heading back to Rome with more paintings to win back his freedom. But Caravaggio had run out of luck. He stopped at Paolo, a harbour town tantalizingly close to Rome, where disaster struck.
The guards arrested him because they said this is a man who has been sentenced to death. They didn't know that he was being pardoned. They kept him in prison for 2 or 3 days and then released him. But his boat had left, and inside there were the paintings that he was giving to Cardinal Borghese, and that were the condition of his pardon.
So he goes north to catch up with the paintings which he needs to give Scipione Borghese. This is one theory of why he goes to Porto Ercole. When some people think that Caravaggio was actually going to Florence and that he'd been invited there by the Florentines. And of course this is possible. We don't really know why he went north.
And this is where the trail abruptly ends. The last contemporary reports suggest that Caravaggio embarked on a frantic race to catch up with the boat that carried his ticket to freedom. Then nothing, until reports of his death on the 28th of July, 1610. Confused, conflicting versions of his demise have spawned rumors and speculation ever since. The reports sparked an unseemly row, sadly consistent with the debacle of his later life. The Knights of Malta decided to reclaim him as one of their own, possibly in order to claim his paintings. Cardinal Scipione Borghese, however, considered himself their rightful owner, since they had been the price of the pardon. The Viceroy of Naples held on to one of the paintings for more than a year before returning it. And, until now, Caravaggio's burial place has been unknown. So, is the mystery finally solved? Are these bones in the Porto Ercole crypt the remains of Caravaggio? Carbon dating, forensic tests, and the detection of lead contamination all indicate that this was a painter of the right age, who died in the right place at the right time, suggesting that this could be Caravaggio.
We know that in the second phase of his career, he was more popular than ever and very productive. So with time, the contamination might have increased exponentially.
So did the paint itself cause the death of Caravaggio?
I would say that the lead made him gradually embrace death. But I do not rule out that the resulting progressive weakening of his immune system might have turned a simple thing like a wound into the cause of death.
Caravaggio's life and art are extraordinarily intertwined. And I think this is why he appeals so much to the modern world. It's hard to say whether the life affects the art, in exactly what way, and this kind of territory is really very dangerous for writers on art. But nonetheless, with Caravaggio, you can't help it, because these paintings seem so personal and they seem in such an extraordinary way to follow the events of his life.
Caravaggio sees dynamically and shows his paintings dynamically.
What does Caravaggio's work have that attracts his audience? Caravaggio uses tricks to create an emotional and intense connection between his paintings and his audience.
He's absolutely aware he does not make mistakes in proportions. This myth that Caravaggio makes mistakes because he is incapable is another of the myths we are now able to dismiss.
When you get to Caravaggio, you realize that the person that you are looking at in the picture is or was a real person. And this is just so extraordinary. It is like Andy Warhol borrowing another something from somewhere else, but this is borrowing a real image from some. Nobody was able to do that before. It's not within their concept. And so he does change perception in this way, and it is an enormously touching thing when you realize that these are real people.
Boredom and a morphine addiction make for a dangerous mix as a young doctor's notebook continues tonight. Daniel Radcliffe and John Hamm star in a brand new episode at 9 on Sky Arts 1 HD.